Hello, 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 and welcome to this panel discussion at the Future Law Virtual Summit on going a little more deeply into the circular economy. And we have with us this morning some of who I believe to be some of the leading innovators, thinkers, and actors in circular economy worldwide. I think to make shorter work of it, guys, I will invite each of you to introduce yourselves. So I'll take it one at a time. So we have today Professor Ed Kosior. We have Alexandre Lemille. We have Harald Friedl, and we have Courtney Savie Lawrence, who are all participating in this panel discussion. And perhaps we could just have a little round of introductions. Ed, maybe you can go first. I know you were just presenting, but if you could just tell us, is Ed frozen? Yeah. If you could just tell us who you are and your connection with the topic of circular economy for those who are now joining us.
Yes, so I'll just try and get my camera working again. Sorry, it's all working now. Yes, I'm Edward Kosior. I'm an honorary professor at Brunel University, but also run a company which is involved in both research and development for plastics recycling, but also we design and supervise the building of plastics recycling plants. And we have a great interest in plastics being a service to mankind, but also making sure that these materials don't end up in all the bad places where they've been, ending up over the last decade. So we've been developing technologies that can actually lift the value of these materials back into what we call the circular economy.
Thanks, Ed. Harald?
Hey everybody, I'm Harald. Good morning. Thanks Margaret and team for putting this all together. Just want to make a big shout out to all of you. Amazing what has been happening over the last hours and days. Yeah, I'm Harald. I'm a student of circular economy. That's what I always say. I was indeed the CEO of an organization called Circle Economy over the last 3 years with 70 people working out of Amsterdam, to make sure or to try to change systems from a linear perspective to a circular one. And we have been doing this with cities, governments, and businesses and business alliances. Since February, when I stopped that after 3 years, I'm now advising the global climate negotiations. We're working the team of the Global Climate Action Champion. So that's a team that looks globally on how we change industries and how it changes society to a net zero 2050 pathway. Their circular economy is a very important driver, a very useful tool to get to a world that we want to get to. So negotiating the new normal is something that has been happening in a circular economy over the last decades. Yeah. And truly we haven't gotten there yet. There were very encouraging signs. I think that's very positive. But we're living in a new day and age, so that's good. We have a different, I think, opportunity right now. As one, we are running out of time, but two, we have all the ability, the knowledge, and the technology at hand to actually make it happen, and that makes me so positive. And so I'm very happy to be part of this panel to discuss it, how we can apply it and how we can make it happen.
Yeah, thank you, Harald. Really privileged and excited to have you here. Courtney?
Hi, everybody. Nice to follow both of the other panelists as well. So I'm based here out of Bangkok, Thailand, and I've been in Asia for several years. And just to share a little bit of the background, and I think some of the perspective that I'd be coming at this conversation with would be literally around the systems transition perspective, right? So I really enjoyed the technical presentation that Professor Kosior just shared earlier. And I remember meeting actually together at the Global Challenges retreats a few years ago. So really exciting to see the work evolve, and same with Harald, nice to see you again. But here out of Asia, where the challenge of the industry, specifically if you look at plastics as well, is dramatic. And two kind of threads and tracks in which I'm working. One is specifically as the co-initiator of a 100% volunteer-driven social innovation platform called Circular Design Lab. And this is a completely social capital and civic capitally driven initiative where ordinary everyday people are coming together to really try to look at the issues, not circular economy, actually circular design specifically as one of the threads, but actually a component is mindsets and the political economy shift as well. So that's one thing I'd be happy to share a little bit more about. And then on the other hat that I wear, I work full-time also with UNDP's innovation team regionally. And circular from a policy upstream standpoint is obviously a top topic. And so what we're really trying to do when we look at not just downstream in citizen engagement and shift, but also what is it specific to, similar to what we were just talking in the previous conversation, you know, what will incentivize business leaders, what will incentivize policymakers to shift the landscape of the dynamics structurally so that we can transition to, similar to the point Harald was just making, we're really running out of time, we know this. So how do we harness all of this collective wisdom as well as knowledge and move the political will, because we see things moving in tandem. And just one last little thing is, you know, it's also an interesting moment, literally here in Thailand right now, there's protests going on the streets calling for regime change. And if you really look at the ways in which, you know, civic movements globally are demanding so much more of leadership, not only here in Thailand, but in so many other countries, either through a democratic process or another version of that. It's a really interesting moment and an exciting moment, but one that we're looking for stewardship at all levels, I would say. So long intro, but I'm happy to be here and have this chat with everybody.
Thank you for that intro, Courtney, and yeah, real privilege to have you join this panel discussion as well, and to point to some other work you are doing with your hat on, as with another hat on, that I'll bring in later on. And I'll come to Alexandra shortly, but just to pick up on what you said, it went central to what we are hoping to generate out of this dialogue is what are the policy positions, what are the regulations, what are the things we can take to governments to say these are our demands, these are the things that should be on the table, and so that we can begin the negotiation for this or continue or help the work of the negotiation that you guys have been doing in your field. You know, if we could get an army of lawyers supporting you. So let me bring Alexandra Lamille on, who I think is a really fascinating player or actor in the circular economy because of his specific take on it. But I wouldn't, I will let him explain his connection with the circular economy. Hi, Alexandra.
You're not being neutral, Margaret. Hi, Margaret. Hi, everybody. Hi. I'm being hit by the sun, but I won't let it go, so too bad. It's going to be like that. Hi, everybody. Alexandre Lemille. I am, I don't know, I'm just a piece of a puzzle, which is complex, together with Harald, Courtney, and Professor Kosior, and everybody else on this panel. But I've been launching together with other co-founders the African Circular Economy Network, which is now a network active across 17 countries in Africa with over 105 experts. So I'm really in the back office helping to run the network, but this is about African leaders to lead that network, and a lot of change are happening right now within the network. One reason behind me being active in Africa is because I've been doing most of my careers in Africa. My sons are from Franco-Ivory Coast origin, and therefore the future of Africa is my future, and anyway, it's been the future of humanity in any case. So, as always, so very strong presence and activity in Africa, as well as back in France, where I run the Antithesis group, which is a group of experts, of roughly 550 experts in the world, dedicated to sustainable development and circular economy. So we are able to help small to large companies across the globe, from Asia to America, to walk the talk. And lastly, what you mentioned in the nice intro talks that you gave to me, where you are not being neutral, is that I cannot separate social justice and circularity. I mean, if you tell me that circularity is our next model, it has to walk the talk. I mean, there is no room for mistakes, and therefore the social dimension, the what's in it for me, as part of a global community, as well as the meaning of success, what would be our leaders of tomorrow, is critical for me. Unless you change your mindset, your circular economic model will not exactly work according to what's written. So I guess we will talk in details more on Tuesday at 2 p.m. CET, but looking forward to this panel today.
Yeah, thanks. And how I might want to approach this discussion is I would take it first to each of you on a particular area and have you share a little bit on that, and then we'll open it up to a discussion amongst ourselves and any questions that come in from the chat. And so I would like to start with you, Harald, and if you could just share, not Harald. No, I want to start with you, Alex. You're on my screen, and I don't know why I called you Harald, but I want to start with you, Alex, because I think out of the panelists here, yes, I'm not playing favorites, but I just think you have a unique perspective that you're bringing to the circular economy that I do want to put in at the top here, because I think most people, when they think about circular economy, they think about the resources that we are using every day to make materials, and then how do we harness the stocks and flows relating to that. And you are coming in with the human aspect. And if you could just speak for about 3 minutes or 3 to 4 minutes on this human aspect, the human sphere that you are trying to bring into the circular economy, and yeah, share a little bit about that and what that means.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. Well, first of all, I mean, all the concepts and that are behind the circular economy, which are regenerative economy, permaculture concept, the biomimicry, performance economy, cradle to cradle, all of these concepts are considered to be strong foundations of our next economic model. And I recognize them fully as part of the discussion we need to have today, as well as the future discussion of how can we reinvent our world, which would be more locally driven, which would be more regenerative from a relation to natural cycle standpoints, i.e. we talk a lot about recycling, but to me, recycling uses a lot of energy. To me, recycling is still a very linear approach to the economies of tomorrow. We need recycling, don't get me wrong. We will need recycling, because I don't want to engage with Professor Kosior on this topic.
Again, why not?
But yeah. But we need to look what's before recycling in discussions with circular economy, i.e. all the repair, maintain, longer, redesign, which is 80% of circular economy in terms of value creation. But we also forget to talk about the biological nutrients, which is the left-hand side of the graph of the circular economy, where life systems are, and which is, in my view, the most critical part of circular economy. And often we talk about the technical sphere, but not the biological sphere. Within that biological sphere, we have humans, and humans seems to have been skipped from the concept, or at least they are considered users and consumers of another economic model, which, fine, this is an economic model, I'm fine with that. But I ask the question, And this was before all the dramas we saw from the American side of the globe, and all the drama in history, and you know what I'm talking about. So if you forget to understand what are the constellations of values that represent human beings on this planet, and if you don't ask yourself, I mean, what we require from leaders to say tomorrow they will be successful, i.e. preserve the life of future generations, it seems that all debates ends in 2100, like 2101, there's nothing happening anymore. So we need to come up with something that is effective together with efficiency. So circular economy is this, the joint between effectiveness and efficiency, and we need to understand what's in it for the local communities to thrive, move from surviving to thriving in an economy which will grant them access to resources. So that's the article, the Elsevier article, which I wrote with my colleagues Schroeder and Desmond on making sure that circular economy is aligned with human development, i.e. what are the tools we give to local communities, any communities in the globe, to say we will design a circular economy that works for everybody, that embeds, encompasses everyone on this planet, no matter where you come from. And we need to embed the talks about how a circular economy is going to take people out of poverty cycle, injustice, inequality. I mean, you name it, all these nightmares that we've been carrying on for these throughout the previous revolutions and economic revolutions. So if you don't include those topics in the next economic revolution or ecosystemic move, as I prefer to say, we might be missing the target. We might be making again the mistakes of the past. And just to summarize, what I'm just saying is that addressing the needs of anyone on this planet in a service-based economy, moving away from a product, mainly product ownership-based economy, where we would grant access to services, and services is highly flexible, well, we stand a chance to include more people into our economic model and therefore make it more equitable. But if you don't embed it in the DNA of the next model, we will forget it like in the past. So unless the next model is circular or regenerative, whichever the name you choose to use, and has social justice and equality embedded within it as part of its DNA, we might create further mistakes. So that's all I'm saying.
Thanks, thank you. And Harald, I want to come to you next to respond on that and also share your critical perspectives on the circular economy and where we're going from here. Do you have a view on this human sphere, first of all? And
yeah, Margaret, we have 3 minutes, right? Just raise your finger when I have 1 minute left, because I don't have a timer next to me. I don't want to go overboard.
Go, because we don't have enough of you in this summit. We weren't able to get enough of you. So you can go for about 4 to 5. Come on.
Okay, fantastic. Let me try to make it a bit of storytelling and mix it with a bit of relevance to the current situation. Because all the people in the panel, most of them I know very well. So Courtney, I hope over there you are safe and your family is safe. That's the most important. And there's nothing to disagree with Alex on. We have been working together on this topic, and I think sometimes it's also an official conversation. I nearly feel on the way forward that we need to include the human sphere. Alex is totally right, and it's a shame it's not even included yet in the current models how the circular economy works. With my past organization, as Alex knows, I've been trying to do this, and it's not always made easy. And there I want to come back to the point you asked before. What you want to get out of this panel? What do we take into governments, Margaret? Because we can have a huge conversation about everything and the world and my dog, but I think I want to make it very specific according to the takeaways. And I want to warn that we get too deep into rabbit holes, because it also happens on circularity, because the technical questions are very difficult to solve. I want to bring it up relevant, what I think is relevant to the current situation, and quickly talk about 3 things. A, what to take to government. 2, how what Courtney also said, how systems change is necessary and how it relates to circular economy, and 3, about action. 1, taking to governments and making it relevant for what we are seeing now. I work on the global climate change negotiations, and it doesn't matter where you work. You work at a company, you work where I am in the UN, you work for your own NGO. Circular economy is a very powerful way to get somewhere, to hopefully a more sustainable world. And I think how we sometimes start to describe it, as Kate Rayworth was talking about it, to a regenerative and redistributive model. So it's not about the circular economy, really. It's about to get into the model where we want to get to. For the climate change negotiations, when I work now with the aluminium sector, with the cement sector, on how to change the system truly, it's amazing how much are we held up because policies are supporting an old system doesn't work. So one thing I often share, because I'm very passionate, is I want to stop today to argue for a different system, while the people who are defending the old system don't have any explanation why we want to hang on to that system because we know it hasn't worked. So it's a disappointment still that in the building back better opportunities during and after the COVID crisis, we don't see enough happening of smart new policy making that will help to change the system for good. Because now we are still dealing in a system that is promoting something that doesn't work economically, ecologically, and from a societal perspective. That's why Alex's thinking of bringing the human in is so important. The human has to be at the center. Human and nature have to be really at the center of a debate, not an economy. An economy is something that should serve us and shouldn't destroy where we are living. So take to government that it would be really, 1, stop to my first point, it's super important now to use that small time opportunity we still have to introduce policies that are really incentivizing the right things to do. So maybe think about carbon legislation, maybe start to look at what really hasn't worked to change the waste system as we have it now, to really incentivize circular design, for example. Just 2 thoughts that could be helpful, and certainly incentivize the financial system to think long term. I'm just mentioning a couple of examples that are really, really very deep rooted, that keep on destroying what we have. And I was with my kids the other day watching the wonderful documentary by David Attenborough, where he is the narrator about our planet. And I want to give not a negative message today. I think it's for all of us very important to stay with a positive message. Because he says in the intro of the whole documentary, he says, the situation is really difficult, 1. 2, the earth is really resilient, nature. But 3, we as human beings now have the big responsibility to act. Act, not talk, act. And the first thing for acting is start educate yourself. And it's such an emotional start of this explanation how the world works, which is really a good reminder, I think, for all of us. We can do something if we start today. 2, I think what Courtney has been talking about as well, the systems change necessity. So we have to imagine everything we are doing now, we are doing under an old system, where old policies, old laws are incentivizing us not to do the right thing in many ways. And that's really frustrating because we're trying to find the little corners and opportunities where we can work in an old system and incentivize entrepreneurs to do something new. But we all know entrepreneurs can make a lot happen. Human ingenuity and human entrepreneurship are amazing features that we have, and the power to innovate. If it's happening within the laws that are not incentivizing this, we have to change and think about changing the laws. And the second thing is what I keep repeating is, rather than doing a little bit less bad under the current system, we really need to think about how we can do fundamentally better. And fundamentally better, I'll give an example of the climate change work that I'm involved in now. When we look into an industry like aluminium or again cement, because I'm quite intimately focused on the work there, we need to truly in 2020 now make opportunity for the businesses that are truly trying to change to say, writing new policies now will give them the opportunity, maybe when they are enforced in 2023, 2025, to really act in a new system, which will make this reaching of the tipping point much faster. Now we're all struggling, for example, because there's no carbon price to make ends meet under this old system. So that's the second one. And I give another example. Capturing CO2 out of the earth is possible technically. Why it's not happening? Because the financing is not put ready for it, because it's no business case. But why is it no business case? Because the policies are not right. So we are kind of turning in a wheel, and I want to support and applaud everybody who tries to change the system from within. Totally necessary, but we need to reinvent and truly set up a new system. Third point, the only thing I want to say today is action, action, action. Thank you.
Thanks, Harald. And I mean, I look forward to, collaborating with you to understand with even more specificity that this panel can provide the policy interventions that you've discussed. We'd love to go deeper with you on that, because it's about how do we equip lawyers around the world to start advancing these kinds of new policy reform initiatives. I'd love to bring Courtney into the conversation now to talk a little about her perspective, this system transition, this system thinking that needs to go in, the rethinking of the system, and your critical perspectives here. Courtney.
Well, thanks so much. And also very interesting, of course, to follow up all of the amazing speakers and perspectives. So the point of view that I would be, sharing from includes having worked on the ground as an entrepreneur and with other entrepreneurs here in the region that are trying to experiment and also trying to get the futuristic ideas more mainstream, because the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed, as the famous quote would go. But at the other hand of it, I understand through the work, especially with intermediary organizations or international institutions, or policymakers, that they're incredibly risk adverse, right? So who is incentivizing the change that needs to happen, and what does that ecosystem and that structure look like? So I think one of the questions is literally, like, what do we mean by change? And another provocation is actually, is the circular economy just a silver bullet to something that is really more of an intermediary step? So I would argue that it is, if we frame it as the end game goal, we're missing the point. It's actually a part of the transition to where we need to go towards these regenerative societies. And if you really back order that, are we talking about first order change, which is incremental? And I think to the point Harald is making, are we building legislation, policy, incentive structures on old systems and old frames? And that's also why there's this kind of latent frustration that we're not going to be hitting these, the SDG targets or the climate change targets quickly enough, because we're working so incrementally. But how are we supposed to actually be, if we're talking about second order change and looking at the future that's to be coming, well, how do you do that, right? And so much of that's inherently built into perspective, it's built into mindsets, and anyone that's, practicing around systems perspectives understands that's so critical. Culture, there is no change without culture, right? And culture shifts and is highly contextual depending on where you're from, where you're located. And, here I am, originally from North America, but based here out of Asia for several years now, having also lived in South America, in South Africa. And so how do we marry that difference, right, between a prescriptive top-down perspective of what needs to happen and then allowing this kind of localized culture to flourish? So one of the things that I would, I'm saying here is, right, how do we reframe the conversation in and of itself? And then secondly, if we're talking about policy and we're talking about government, or even just the nation state as an actor in the system of literally the infrastructure, how do we help them update their operating system, right? We're on a very old, outdated frame in general, and the relevance of government is being questioned no matter what anyway. But it's a bit of like a Titanic. So how do we, as a collective, work together in building this new ordered system? And then thirdly, I think another piece to this, and there was a thread that Harald was just mentioning, is around capital. It's going to take incredible amount of financing to be able to de-risk the types of investments that are required to transition, to test prototypes, to fund technologies like Ed's company is doing, right? And what is kind of interesting and compelling and exciting, and if there was just a finance report released that was quite robust by Ellen MacArthur Foundation recently, But since COVID and over this past 18 months, especially, an incredible exponential number of investments towards a circular economy types of financing is happening. And if you follow Climate Kick, for example, there's a whole experimentation happening, not only with their approach, which is a portfolio of approach, which is understanding that complexity, which is really just code for we don't know this, the challenge well enough, or we don't know the solution well enough. And I'm paraphrasing a quote from a fantastic futures thinker, Michael McCallum. But the point being is, how do we literally rewire and re-engineer institutionally so that we can take experiments on that spectrum, as well as double down on initiatives that we know are working well. But how do you finance that? So one of the things that they're piloting is transformation capital, understanding that the way that climate finance, or even just literally finance for transitions happens, is going to have to shift, because risk, basically investors, as we typically would know, are incredibly risk adverse. And unless they're the angel investor that's looking for, you know, big risk, high reward. But that model, that unicorn model, doesn't serve the planet, or even literally is gambling, basically, right? So how do we do this smart? How do we do it in a measured way? And then how do we understand that culture and mindsets is so critical? These intangible components are so central at the same time. I'll stop there because I know we have a lot of speakers and a lot of things to cover as well.
Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, Courtney. This incredible panel, so stimulating. So I would like to bring Ed in now, but I do want to pick up on something Courtney said and throw it at you, and then you could give your perspective on what all the other speakers have said so far. You know, Courtney said, you know, when we're thinking about policy change, we have to ask ourselves, are we implementing little patchwork policies that may be just based on the same old ways of thinking and doing in the system? Do we need to have a more transformational approach to policy? I mean, that's what I was hearing her say. And I was wondering whether your policy proposition that you had responded to me, let's tax the people, and the EU regulations that are about taxing. I'm not saying it's not good. I'm sure it's correct and amazing, and it should happen. But could that be, this taxing and incentivizing, be part of the old frame?
It probably is part of the old frame, but and I agree that we do have a patchwork of policies coming up and trying to address the issue, you know, in a traditional way. The problem we have is we have big players in the economy, and we can talk about transforming, you know, the paradigm and transforming government and changing everything, but in reality, that's not going to happen. Even if you change the government, the businesses that work right now, giving people things that they buy every day, is still happening. And, you know, when the supermarkets shut their doors, everyone's up in arms. They want to go back in and buy the things that they want. So the way I've always seen this is, how do we change those companies that are making those supplies of materials? How do we make them different? How do we actually bring them to shift where they're going? I showed an image in my talk of these detergent bottles that were slightly different in color. And the marketing people shook their head and said, no, we can't have a change in color. Now that's a decision. Right now, if you go to the circular economy, we know things are going to be different. And up right now, marketing are making assumptions about people, and they're saying people won't accept it. Well, I think they could try and test. Now, my view has always been, let's try and change things from within and get people on the track, because big companies will not invest in a shock way where they'll completely change their approach. Now, they could do that, but they're very, very unlikely to do that. So I've always thought, you know, like Harald saying, let's act now. So I've always had the knowledge and skills in my area, and I thought, well, I can make changes and I can develop technology which we can use right now. And of course, what's happening now, there are hundreds of thousands of tons of material that are being recovered that were previously thrown away. So that's part of the change. And of course, the EU is going about, you know, a new Green Deal. They've just published a new vision for a green Europe and a circular economy. So those visions will help transform everything, going from grassroots all the way up. but all of these take time. And you know, I heard what Alexander was saying about the need to have the biological part brought in. Now, I'm fully agreeing with him on things like we need to start with redesign. Design is where human intent and action intersect. And that's really the thing that we haven't done. We haven't redesigned products or materials or the way we distribute them very well. And there's huge resistance to change. You know, and I'll give you the example of those colored bottles. Slight shifts in color mean people say, oh, no, we can't go to 50% recycled content. And we know that functionally we can, but marketeers are making that decision. So my view is, you know, we do need to act now. We do need to start the changes. We've got big corporations that will only shift very slightly. And if you change a government and the government brings in radical policies, and all of a sudden we have a disruption to the supply chain, we'll really have problems on our hands. And we've seen this with COVID. When supermarkets closed down, people were clamoring, you know, where's my toilet paper? You know, where are all the things that I want to buy? So we have to shift. I think, quickly as we can, but there's also gaps in technology. We don't have all the technology, but we do have a lot of it. And that technology should be implemented as quickly as possible while we're inventing the new ways of government. And I think while I don't have the exact way of restructuring, so we bring the, if you like, social justice in there, I make one reflection. When we go to India and have a look at how people live, the waste they generate are waste that they've never been able to cope with in the past. Their traditional materials have always, and they've managed to live a quite simple life. We are now making materials that they don't know what to do with at the end of the use of that material. And this is where the brand owners need to understand they're introducing products that have no end-of-life destination for them. And they need to change. They need to change their offering.
May I intervene in this topic?
I'm sorry,
India.
Saswati,
Yes.
there will be an opportunity for questions in the written chat. Not at this time, please.
Sure.
Okay. So we have, big issues with brand owners saying we're making this product in Europe, and now we need to transform and make products in other countries where they don't perhaps have the infrastructure. But the same thing applies in Europe. I was listening to Harald's comments about the aluminium and cement industries. Now, for every ton of cement we make a ton of CO2. Now, I actually don't know how we're going to transform the cement industry, because it's one of the building materials of every city. And we take calcium carbonate, we heat it to make calcium oxide and the other oxides, and we generate CO2. None of that's captured, but no one's stopping the production of cement. Now, there's a real dilemma there, unless we have other programs that actually are able to make that circular by capturing that CO2 in many other formats. Anyway, so my approach has always been action now, take technology that we can use and apply it widely, and try and convince as many big players to make the changes to their product line, and to get consumers to start thinking more about the circular economy. It's a long road. Anyway, I'll stop with those comments.
Yeah, thanks for that. And what I'm getting from all of the panelists for sure is this urgency, that we need to have far more urgency toward action because of, the stats that are coming out and whether we're going to hit the agenda. I want to take it to you, Courtney, because what is happening here is we're seeing their companies and think tanks and organizing around the circular economy from the bottom up, activists and entrepreneurs who are trying to make this happen. We see at the EU regulations, it's certainly taking hold at the European Union level, and you're seeing regulations being put in place to give effect to it. What's going on at the UN level? Because you know that you would be familiar with the system. The UN will come out with model laws. and then it would be promoted to countries around the world. And that is how a lot of regulations get implemented at local levels in the global south in particular. And so is the UN organizing around circular economy to bring a sort of a radical push toward regulating companies and how they produce in society? And yeah, what is being done at that level?
Sure. Thanks for the question. And just disclaimer, I cannot speak on behalf of the UN. So anything I share is just my interpretation or perspective. So I speak in terms of the region that I'm working, which is the Asia and Pacific, and it's absolutely a critical issue. It's an everyday type of conversation that is being had with governments at the country level. So across the board, what that looks like is people are, I should say, different countries are at different starting points for the readiness of what level and what scale of a conversation that is to be had. What I can say is that we are working, primarily the innovation team is working with different UN, and this is the UNDP specifically, so I'm not speaking on behalf of the environmental program, et cetera, but we're working with different country offices and their governments on trying to take a more experimental approach. So a lot of what I was sharing earlier in terms of a projected how things should be transitioning is literally part of the work that is striving to be done in the trenches. So it's actually about de-risking the ways in which government might be setting a policy and or learning about ways to manage a specific dimension of this. So usually, at least in the case of the Asia Pacific, we're talking about waste, right? We're talking about plastics, talking about very concrete, tangible things. A lot of the conversations, such as through Alliance to End Plastic Waste, are looking at this compact of how businesses can align. So to the point that Ed is making, or Harald as well, how might big business, big industries be also understanding this transition away from? So similar to or analogous to the fossil fuel industry, you have to, what does decarbonization look like when your whole business model is built on that? What does transitioning away from utility of utilizing plastic in your supply chain when your conventional model has been built on that? So it's a very complex, again, as I already mentioned, not one size fits all type of discussion and type of agenda. But I would also just say that there is not one, universal, I guess, law or regulation that's being prescribed from the ASEAN or the regional perspective. But we are definitely paying attention, as the world is as well, as to what kind of the front runners are doing. So the way that the EU has been setting the targets and showing through action, by experimenting, or the city of Amsterdam, and cities, I should also mention, are such dynamic levers for change that probably go a little bit unrecognized or less recognized than when we think about national policy. But when you look at cities really driving, and literally most of the population is going to be living in cities in 50 years from now, the majority will. So looking at these urban ecosystems is really critical as well. And I will say, actually, just one last thing, and this is, sorry, it's not really answering your direct question of what is the UN doing, other than serving as a facilitator, as a platform for these different types of approaches, as well as, exchanging good practices, different ways in which we're noting policy happening on the edges or the horizon. But the country of, or I should say Indonesia, as you may have known, is really looking to reduce their plastic use and waste by 80% in the next 10 years, or by 2040 specifically. And so they've been, and this is a report that came out with Pew and the World Economic Forum just in the past 6 months alone. But what they've done is worked with a company called Systemic and really modeled different scenarios of what it looks like if we don't do anything, to what if we did everything possible that we know that's in our toolbox. And they're working with, to me, what's one of the unique things that's happening is that they're actually coordinating with a very diverse multi-stakeholder approach. So you are talking about organizing business, you are talking about organizing government, and you are talking about creating space for entrepreneurs, like the Zero Waste Living Lab that's MView is championing, for example, a partner in this whole initiative. But it's a whole of society approach. And I think that case study in and of itself is quite fascinating, because it's also right here in the heart of the issue, where plastics, again, going back to Ed's presentation, the best way to not have to deal with plastics in the ocean is to not have it even get into the ocean in the first part. And so what does that look like when you redesign materials? What does it look like when you redesign supply chains and consumer culture and demand for what is or is not allowed? In Thailand, we banned plastic bags from a policy standpoint last year, and then COVID hit and everything's back to plastic again. So it's there's so many other shocks to the system that can really move the trajectory of an intent of a policy into another direction. So it's complicated. But I will say one thing that really, for me, is extremely helpful is just to literally have a framework of what does it even mean to be transitioning from this, socio-technical transitions. And if you look at history, we know we're in the middle of huge strides. And to me, that's, we're putting together in this conversation so many, pluses and minuses and challenges and opportunities, but it's part of the process. So I'd say that what's exciting is that this is a globally recognized discussion, and circular economy is no longer on the fringe. It's literally a question, it's an ambition for how to really think about how society operates. And the last thing, the last thing is just going back to this notion around, the reframe and putting the human at the heart of it too, to Alexandre's, his point initially, with the Circular Design Lab here out of Bangkok, we were wondering, should we call it the Circular Economy Lab? And we actually, very much by design and by choice, said, no, we don't want, the misnomer of economy can be quite, it's a loaded word, it's a loaded term. So we wanted to focus on community. And if you put in circular economy, suddenly the agenda can accidentally get hijacked or moved into another direction. So just to say the semantics around it are also quite fascinating, I think, when we talk about what needs to happen and then the main agenda in and of itself.
I think Harald wants to jump in. Did you want to jump in, Harald? Because I will tell you, I think that there is an opportunity for the UN to do a little more if we're serious about collective organizing around this issue of circular economy. And there is a role to play for regulation, because if you have players in the system who are benefiting from the legislative infrastructure that exists, and those would be the petrochemical industry and all of these players that are benefiting from the existing infrastructure. How are we getting them to change? By just telling them it's the right thing to do and it's the moral thing to do. We have one shared planet. So I see legal system intervention as critical. And the UN, the United Nations as a body, is the body that we have put together to deal with our shared planet issues, our collective issues. And regenerative society on this planet is a collective issue. It is not an EU issue, it's not an India issue, it's not a Caribbean issue, it is a collective issue. And I think that if the UN truly recognizes that this is urgent and we need to have this a regenerative society within the next decade, then we need to have the impetus, I think, of legislation. So I throw it out to the panel, whoever wants to respond. If we do not have some sort of collective organizing at a regulatory level for governments, of model laws that governments can look to and say, okay, I want to do this. Let's figure out how. Here are these model laws, and let's see what's applicable in my jurisdiction. How will we get there? Is the work that you're all doing just, solving little problems here and there, but only achieving 60% or I want to throw it out to anyone who wants to jump in. Yeah, Ed.
So let me quickly say, the European Union has launched its Circular Economy Action Plan. So I'm going to put it into the chat. I'll put the PDF there so people can have a read. It's available on the European Commission website, and it maps out what can be done in a whole range of sectors. And they are calling it an action plan. So it's very much, it'll be the typical European thing where there's a lot of engagement across the board because they have to bring 27 countries with them, minus UK, of course, it used to be 28. And they're trying to give everyone an indication of where they're going and what the speed of transition is. Now, each of those countries are, of course, not compelled to make the changes, because the European Union is not the United States of Europe at the moment. It's still very much many countries working together, and there are problems in actually forcing countries to take an approach. So there are some countries that are very cavalier about their approach to CO2 emissions, and others that are far more stringent and are leading. And it's really the leading examples that will set the pace for everyone else. And typically because they will actually have the economy following them. So low carbon inputs can be more efficient, and also the products are more likely to be picked up by consumers. So the businesses that actually transform products in a better way will be the ones that will prosper. And that's what will make governments change, because they will see that there's an economy driving this. And and what we've got to do is incentivize those businesses to make the transformation. Now, how does that happen? In Europe right now, if you want to develop new techniques or new innovations, there is a lot of financial support in research projects and technologies that support the circular economy. There is massive amounts of money being offered to universities and so on. One of my problems is the approach of the EU is very bureaucratic. And so I was asked to review some research projects, and they would have something like 28 participants all saying, we're going to create a new circular economy, but with nothing specific in there. So we're spending money, spinning wheels, but not actually guaranteeing any output or outcome. So that's one of the worries, that you don't get things heading in the right direction. So I find it better for governments to set the targets, and provide, if you like, the incentive to avoid taxes, because that makes businesses listen and respond, and they get up and they do things, and then they invest in technologies which they think are very close and will help them avoid paying taxes. So the EU is there, it's got the right moves, it's better than any other model, certainly better than the US, better than many other countries. And in Asia, and I listen with great interest to what Courtney's saying, it's the big unknown. We have the majority of the world's population there, we have the majority of the world's resources and plastics production and all these other consuming areas, yet we don't know how they're going to respond and what will actually drive them to a more efficient process. So I watch with interest, and I just hope that the things that we're applying in Europe can get picked up elsewhere as well. And in many cases, I actually know they can be applied faster because of the infrastructure that's there and the way people work versus Europe. So I know that technologies can go in that direction.
Margaret, can I jump in there with a little comment and then play it back to you? So first play it back to you. The conversation is going into so many different directions, Margaret. For the remainder of our time, I just advise you, if you focus us a little bit, that would help. I think, in making us more.
I'm focusing you on legal system intervention. And so the issue that I have been raising is how do we regulate at a collective level to make this happen? And we looked at what Courtney was saying, that yeah, there's nothing going on at that level, though there is a lot going on to facilitate this sort of development in innovation spaces and all of that, and design. And Ed has just come in and speaking about the EU having a model for regulation, which I think is very helpful, because maybe we can look to that model that the EU is could be the most advanced in terms of thinking about policy in this space, and see how that can be adapted in different countries. So maybe you didn't see the flow that I was going with, but that's where I was. And so when I threw it out, we're looking to see, you guys are advocating for a more regenerative society. And I am coming at it, looking at this to see, well, how can lawyers and legal systems be employed to support and facilitate the development of regenerative societies? So yeah. You were going to say something, Harald?
Yeah, that's an interesting. I was just I don't know if I'll answer for this. I have to think, but it's like saying so okay, let's step a step. So one is what lawyers can particularly do. For me, there's no difference between a lawyer, an engineer, or an economist. I guess everybody's bringing something to the party. But the picture needs to be clear where we are going, and then it needs to be divided up in I think the different work packages. Generally, I think if you
right. Well, let me just correct you. Not what lawyers could do, but what governments can do.
Yeah,
I'm looking at the top-down infrastructure.
Yeah, I wanna bring out my small ideas, but I first want to say something about what Ed said. Ed, I find it highly dangerous to put one country or one group of countries on a high horse or on a pedestal in a debate that is truly will not be driven by Europe alone. And I find this in international negotiations very sensitive when we and actually difficult when we put the EU example out there as the thing to follow. And I'm leaving it to Alex from an African perspective, and also Courtney to go into this. In my work internationally on climate change, it's not helpful when you tell the Chinese, the South Americans, or the Asians. The EU is a great example. We're starting now discussions with, we should always recognize at the beginning, and I think that's the new level of diversity and respect we have together. Different parts of the world will obviously develop in different ways. And I'm sure you think about this very similarly, so it's not an antagonistic conversation I want to promote here. But what Courtney said is very important, the semantics. And in this context, the most promising or the most hopeful signal from a policy perspective, where I want to go back to now, Margaret, is not the EU action plan or the EU Green Deal, which was to be expected, to be very honest. And that's what we have to do anyway. It was in the last 2 weeks, the Chinese commitment to go net zero by 2060 makes me, not because I disregard what the EU is doing, because it's fantastic, but the new signal and novelty that China commits itself to something that we truly can only help the Chinese to achieve and could do together gives me really hope. So Margaret, from a policy perspective, that commitment needs now to be filled with life. And as we know, also China has a very particular way to go about things, but they will need international best practices. Look at the EU, for example, or look at other, maybe in the ASEAN context, we find very good example. And they have to work with international businesses, which are often not Chinese owned because international value chains are long, to work on these solutions. So in the work I've been doing, I would see 3 different things to get very briefly to the policy question. When we think about, and Ed, you talked about cement industry. Yes, we don't know it, how we get there at the moment, but it's amazing that an industry like the airplane industry a month ago says we're going to go net zero. Something that has been unspoken of last year and unthinkable that even the airliners would say we want to go that way. Now we come all to the table. Hopefully good system thinkers, the economists, the lawyers, the international negotiators, civil society, the cities of this world, and say what can a roadmap look like, or the vision statement can look like, and then a roadmap how to get there. Definitely financing is not in place, definitely enough policy is not in place, and also technology is not there yet. So the change curve will be increasingly exponential over the next 3 decades. And in that first plans that we are seeing, we have a national component, Margaret, coming back to the policy question you're trying to focus on. So the national policymakers will need to do something in all over the world. That's one. The second one I find very interesting, for example, in the built environment industry, it's not anymore the countries, I think, that's setting all the important laws. They have an important role to play in procurement, but it's international associations like the World Green Building Council that gives very clear recommendations for developers, but also for public procurement, for cities that are shaping that space and creating a demand, for example, for green steel and green cement. The third one, which we cannot get around, I believe, for example, on aluminium, is in some global commoditized markets, there will be no solution if we don't elevate a conversation to a G20, G8 level, where leading organizations that are shaping these markets are making commitments and trying to get to a level playing field. Which brings me to my last comment back to the UN. The UN is a fantastic body. I've worked there myself, but we can't expect from the UN we can't expect of the UN to do something it can't do. So we have to be clear on the limitations of the UN. I'm not saying it's not functioning well. I'm not saying it's not good. I'm just saying we have to limit ourselves in our clear expectation who is doing what, and then they divide the cake. So what you said, Margaret, last comment, collective policy making will come out of a potpourri, a mix of enabling different policy makers at different levels, either national policy, either in frameworks that provide a way of thinking like the World Green Building Council. And we can't shy away from international conversations at the G8, G20 level, where the big people, the big companies and big countries in the world are leading the way to try to get change happen there. Thank you.
Companies leading the way. Right. I want to bring Alex into the conversation here because you said the African Circular Economy Network, you'll have set that up. Is that correct? Are you all looking at the policy spaces there?
Well, the African Circular Economy Network is a network that was created in South Africa. And I was just one of the co-founders. I mean, there are many of us in the team. And the network is more a network of experts in the field, experts in biomimicry, experts in business models, innovations, and so on. So it's more, we are more providing and identifying innovators and startup leaders that are changing the rules of the games on the field, but it's more from a business standpoint. That makes us very complementary with what the African Development Bank and the African Circular Economy Alliance are doing together with the African Union in terms of the policy work they do. When we go back to Europe briefly, I mean, not Europe, the UN briefly, the UN is fully involved in the EPR setup in Nigeria, but we don't see them much active anywhere else. But mainly the African Development Bank is very much active because they are hosting the alliance, which is an alliance of governments starting with South Africa, Rwanda, and Nigeria, who have set the rules of an alliance whereby they will advise and they will discuss. And now the alliance has grown to 15, 16 members, where they are discussing ways to implement laws and regulations across Africa. The African Development Bank is hosting that alliance, so they sit in Ivory Coast, and the African Development Bank has designed a support program, what they call African Circular Economy Facility, and I was involved in the design of that program in basically 3 phases. I mean, there is one part of the program which is about helping and getting up to speed the government when it comes to creating a circular legal framework. And this will be done through advices on how to design the right circular economy laws, webinars and seminars and workshops with parliamentaries and decision makers in different governments, starting with the least developed countries, according to the African Development Bank classification. Because they believe that Rwanda, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Morocco can design their own framework without much support, whereas the least developed countries, Niger, Chad, and so on, are in need for acceleration of this framework creation. So that's one part of the program. The other part of the program is about identifying the current businesses that are willing to innovate and test product ranges and test their R&D on circular economy and helping them develop those innovations to accelerate the shift of the companies towards circular economy. And the last part is mainly an incubation program whereby startups will be invited to be incubated through different business hubs in Africa. And these startups, that's where ACEN, the African Circular Economy Network, sorry, lots of similar acronyms. So ACEN, which is a non-for-profit corporate, will jump into the picture by identifying those startups and those innovators to be funded, to be incubated, so that they can grow and replicate across the continent.
Cool. Yeah, so I've shared some of the links that you all have been discussing, but Ed, I just want to take it to you. What Harald said about holding up EU as a model, and now Alex sharing about all that is being done in Africa at that level, and Courtney sharing about what Thailand has done in the chat. Any responses?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when you look at the EU, there's a framework that encompasses, you know, something like 380 million people. There is a framework. In Africa, I don't know if we have a framework. In the United States, we could potentially address to many people, but politically,
when you say framework,
you're
saying political framework.
There's a political and a governing framework, because right. The EU can pass regulations which have to be ratified by all the countries and adopted, and so it's quite doable. But my feeling is that I'd love to see alternative models, and the EU has been one of the most powerful driving forces for innovation. They have actually funded a lot of new technologies that have actually come out and being used. And, you know, I'm highly interested in how China is going to achieve its goals. And there's no doubt they will drive very strongly towards that goal, which is fantastic to see happening. And it will set the target for everyone. Now, in some ways, the fact that the EU has set its own goals and then they've been, if you like, superseded by China is an example of how one country can set a goal and then another. And there's no doubt in the United States, they'll be looking at these goals and saying, well, we're not going to be left behind. We're not going to be the pariahs globally, because eventually everyone knows that there's one planet and we're all bearing the consequences of climate change. And the circular economy is one response to the climate change agenda. It's only one part of it. So my feeling is let's get all the good models that we can, whether they be from South America or Africa or Asia, and let's put them up and let everyone learn from what's going on. I'm just simply saying, you know, the EU has set the pace. You know, countries like Britain have been dragged screaming and kicking into the world of recycling. It has addressed its waste because the EU has set the targets, and that reluctantly businesses have changed and transformed and slowly started to meet them. So the more good models we have, the better, and the more we can actually learn from them. You know, I'm stuck in Australia now. We have a government that doesn't know whether it believes in climate change here, and they've not really, they abolished a carbon price on carbon, which they did have at one point, set by one of the governments and then superseded by others. So we've got a government that doesn't really accept that climate change is an issue, even though the last 5 years have been the hottest 5 years on record. And they say, oh, well, there's nothing happening. So, you know, but eventually, if they want to export to another country, which has standards, which reflect the carbon footprint of those products, then they'll actually stop and listen, because they'll realize their trading partners are setting standards which they can't meet. And that's the way you bring recalcitrant countries into line, because everyone else is unified on these goals. And I find the EU has had a powerful impact on leadership across the world. And I think this is really quite a very great lesson for everyone in this area. So I'm not saying it's the only one, but you know, I do think it's very useful. How Africa gets coordinated, I don't know. I wish Alexander luck there, because it's such a diverse continent. It has 1 billion people in it, and it's going to grow faster than any other population center in the world. And it's full of huge challenges. And I wish him well in coordinating that area, because it does need coordination. And we do very much want to see this progress happening everywhere.
Well,
huge challenges and huge opportunities. Yeah, Alex, you wanted to?
Yeah, just one or two comments. I mean,
for sure.
Why? I mean, Africa is very active and Europe is very active because I mean, Europe is at the origin. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And I'd like to hear Saswati about that in a minute. But I mean, why Europe has put all these regulations and is being active is because the ecological footprint of these countries in Europe are the biggest in the world. So they are the origin of a wrongly designed model that needs a fix. And Africa is somehow the victim of that model, because they are being poured with waste coming from Europe now that Malaysia and China doesn't want it anymore. So that's the problem, and we can deal with that and discuss with that for hours. But Africa, in terms of coordination, so far it works through ministries of the environment. So they meet on a regular basis every 3-4 months through the AMSEN conference, which is the conference of the ministries of the ministers of the environment. And they often meet in Durban or in different places across the continent to align themselves with the same targets, as well as to discuss circular economic measures. And through AMSEN, through the 3 governments I mentioned earlier, they have launched this alliance, which is now being active as we speak at the end of this year to implement the circular economy visibility across the continent. And now, don't get me wrong, I mean, in the World Bank list of challenges, and Africa is in red everywhere, unfortunately, but that's why circular economy is much needed, together with other models, as Courtney mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I wanted to see if I see we have about 15 minutes left. If we can bring in Saswati, are you here? Would you like to pose your question to one or other of the panelists?
Yes, I'm not too sure to whom should I address it to, but maybe Professor Edward. So my question is, from what I understand, EU is definitely leading the way in climate negotiation, because from what I have read, it has taken a proactive role to always, the host has asked me to start my video. So I'm actually in a very casual form of clothing, and I would like to reserve my privacy and not show my picture, if that is okay.
That's all right. That's all right, Saswati. But could you say where you are coming in from, your country? And
sure. So right now I am located in India, and I'm a resident of India. My nationality is India, but I went to study in the Netherlands last year, and we had a subject on climate change, wherein we had to like study a lot of material, and we also had to write a paper. And that's how I got interested with climate change. Most of the topics that you've mentioned today, or which have come up in this panel discussion, are the topics which I have gone through, because I'm regularly in touch with the ICPP. The names are so confusing. Website, which actually leads the way for climate negotiation. And my paper was about emerging economies, and emerging economies being China and a lot of other bunch of countries which have come to the forefront, because all of a sudden they have started to emit a lot more. And there is a shift in balance because of course, it's a hugely populated country. And my question is mainly, I mean, I don't know if there is an appropriate question or not, but there was something which was raised about India. Maybe I could talk about that. So a couple of days back, I was thinking about reuse, recycle, repurpose. So let's take a small example of plastic, like polythene or polybag that we generally use to, go to the market and take our vegetables. And as a matter of practice, we generally keep the polythene so that it can be used again and again. But the point is, where does that reuse end? As a matter of practice, we keep polythene so that, we can reuse it multiple times. But there is no fixed number as to what is that multiple time and when does that stop. This is one part of it. Second is because of this rise in e-commerce websites, there has, and of course, because of COVID-19, there has been a sharp increase in buying of online clothes and rampant buying of online clothes. And it's a natural human tendency that, we tend to buy clothes, we tend to buy more clothes, and then after a point of time, we get bored of those clothes. But then when, suppose, for example, we are shifting from one country to another country and we want to give away those clothes and nobody's ready to take those clothes, what do we do with those clothes? Do we throw it? Do we, I don't know. Even these days, orphanages and all these institutions, they have a very high standard. They don't want to use the reused clothes. Where does that cloth go to? Yeah, I mean, I don't know if and of course, if you kind of burn those clothes, that will lead to emissions, and that will contribute to my contribution in the whole climate change debate. So yeah, this might be a good question to ask as well. What do you do with the clothes that you stop wearing? And there is this famous slogan of reuse. And what is the exact number? How many times do you reuse and then throw away? Like, what is the shelf life? Because most of the times these plastics in which we buy our vegetables from, it's not written exactly, okay, fine, you have to throw it after like using it 5 times. So how does that, how do you think that gap can be bridged in terms of lawmaking? Okay. For sure, but more practical. In the form of customary practice. Okay. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, practical. Sazwati is asking from a practical perspective. Yeah.
Okay. So Swati, so let's take your poly bags for a start. Use them as long as they're functional. Keep using them forever. Basically, if they're functioning, keep using them. One of the challenges in India is most of the recycling that's done is industry to industry. What we try to do, because we have an office in India, what we try to do is to initiate post-consumer recycling. Now, my wife, Fiona Matthews, who runs the Earth Champions Foundation, was working with the pickers in Pune. And what they're trying to do is to take post-consumer plastics, in other words, from the household, and then for those materials to be collected and then put into a recycling stream. So the granules or the plastics that are made from that can be turned into new products. So that's where the circularity gets extended. So what we have to do as consumers is use them as much as we can and then put them in the correct place. Don't put it into the bin, or the landfill stream, because I've been to Indian landfills and they are terrible because they're full of materials that have, there's so much food that goes in those landfills. That food should be composted. There's not enough segregation. So the women who are, if like, the models of virtue in terms of resource efficiency, they actually pick those materials apart and they segregate them, and they then put those materials back into commerce. They sell those materials for them to be reused. So paper, plastics, aluminium, glass, and so on. So they're the segregators. So in India, they play that role because the councils don't do anything very, very constructive with what they call waste at the end of its use in the first cycle. So And we can actually functionally recycle plastics multiple times, depending on what has happened to the material. But to give you a rule of thumb, you know, most plastics can be recycled at least 5 times and more without any big deficiency in their technical behavior. And at the end of that, you could say, well, what happens at the end of that 5 times or could be 10 times? Well, there are some long-term products that we use every day. So I'll give you a quick example. Your poly bags could end up as a film for use as a waterproof membrane that goes under every concrete slab. When they put a building down on the ground, they put a waterproof membrane. That membrane will be there for 40 years or 100 years, and that can contain a lot of recycled plastic. So what you have is basically a cascade of applications. So you go from one application to another, and then it doesn't have to stay in the same loop, but then it goes into something that's long-lived and of direct benefit, and it replaces fossil fuel-made materials. But let me make a quick comment on clothing. The fashion industry has created a model for people to say, buy it and don't repair it. When you're sick of it, do something with it and go buy some new things. The stores are full of clothes that are bought that people don't need to buy because it's a fashion thing and they make changes. How we solve that problem goes back to a societal thing. Now, you could say like that in China, everyone has to wear, you know, this is some time ago, you know, very drab clothes, and that's what you have to wear the uniform. But of course, those days, even in China, are long gone. So we have to have societal change, which actually makes materials repairable and makes them long lasting and not worn out. I always laugh when some of my kids or grandkids come in with jeans that are torn. I said, look, I'll give you $5 so you can go buy yourself a new pair. Right. But this is a fashion to look trendy while it's worn out. I mean, my God, I mean, it's atrocious.
And I do want to jump in here. That, you know, one of the underlying things I think coming out of Saswati's question is, you know, from a practical perspective, and underlying that is, what can I as a citizen do? How much more can I do to create change in this area? Where do I show up? And I wanted to, because I'm looking, we just have a few more minutes. I do want to go to Courtney one last time before I ask for closing remarks from everyone, because Courtney, you were involved in a citizen-led legal reform initiative that's quite fascinating that you shared on yesterday. I don't know if you wanted to come in a little bit and share a bit about that.
Sure, and I would actually also just mention quickly to the question, Sawasti, that you're bringing up. I just put in the chat box a link to something called Fashion Revolution, which is now a movement globally. And I learned about it because one of the volunteers that came to the Circular Design Lab, she's Thai, and she initiated the first version of the Thai version of the Fashion Revolution group here. And she ended up becoming a lead for we did a track on unsustainable fast fashion, using systemic design as a process to figure out what are some of the contextual ways we could intervene in the system to shape a different trajectory. And so I just wanted to say that from, you know, there is no specific response to your question because it really depends on the context. So there's lots of models and there's lots of, I think, networks to get inspired by and possible solutions. But I'd say it starts right where you are, and you might find that there's a lot of people asking the exact same question. And maybe you already know that, and you're representing that voice of the curious as well. But we're actually just, next Wednesday, we're gonna be running the Circular Design Lab. We're gonna be running a Systemic Design 101 workshop, and we're gonna bring in all of the folks that have already been interested in waste, air pollution, unsustainable fast fashion, and a new one on food systems. And we're not only going to be looking at it from silos, like, okay, now you're the food group or you're the air group. We're actually going to be practicing a new version of this where we start looking at the different interconnections from the context of where we are in our city and in our country, and start looking at what are some hyper solutions to some of these issues that are all interrelated. So if you look at the fashion supply chain, you know, we have a huge challenge of not only just the water resources being depleted, or even human labor conditions specifically, like human rights issues around that at fast fashion. to then, the mindsets of this capitalist culture of literally linear, just buy and consume and then throw away. So there's a million different things you could actually do beyond just literally, asking yourself what to do with the materials of the clothes on your back. But anyway, I'd be happy to continue that chat with you and think about how to connect it with some of the other players and initiatives I know in Asia working on it. And then the other piece, the last thing I wanted to mention in closing is back to that big meta question, Margaret, you're asking from a legal standpoint, this is the Future Law Institute, right? Virtual summit. So what does it look like to be, applying and developing new frames for legal systems? And one, which I found in our process here of trying to get the first Clean Air Act of Thailand established through this process where we as a bunch of angry, citizens saying, hey, this air quality issue is a human rights issue and it's structural violence and it's not okay that big industries are polluting the commons, and then that there's children with increased rates of asthma, or there's elderly that are with decreased lifespans and everything else in between. So I found out by meeting people that ended up coming to these workshops, that in the constitution here in Thailand, there's a mechanism for citizen-driven policy change. So agnostically speaking, if you get over 10,000 citizen signatures with the proposed legislation, you can get that tabled at Parliament. And this is something that just blew my mind, because what that meant is that we could move fast. We don't need to lobby a certain, electorate or politician. We can literally say, build our own campaign. And that's exactly what we're doing right now. So we're in the process of, we've got our first 600 of 10,000 signatures. We've just allowed that green light only late August. So we're a collaboration of all volunteers between the Thailand Clean Air Network and the Circular Design Lab. And there's also, by the way, another version of this 10,000 signatures that's happened by the Thai Business Chamber. But you can imagine what kind of legislation that they have. For example, $100 fine for polluting. So we're taking a very different approach, and the regulation will look very different compared to their version. But just to say that just imagine, and this is part of my next version of research I want to do, is around finding out how many constitutional agreements at a nation state level exist in which citizens can create their own policy through a certain type of process. To me, that's a game changer. If every country in the world had that, you could really push consumer demand, not just consumer demand, but citizen demand for the climate action that we really want to see happen at an accelerated rate. It's not about just boycotting an industry of sorts or boycotting and saying no to something. It's about saying yes to a version of the future that, literally seems right and just. So happy to be in touch with folks anywhere after this happens to wrap up, but thanks for having me. And I think, Margaret, you're probably doing your tour de table on the closing remarks at this point.
You muted yourself at the end.
Yep,
you
I just said I'm finished.
Okay, yeah, that area is actually an area we at Future Law have started the research on, and there are several countries in the world where you can have citizen-led legal reform initiatives, and the whole purpose of our network communities of practice is to stimulate that kind of policy entrepreneurship from the bottom up. So definitely stay plugged in with us, and we have a network community of practice dedicated to that sort of direct democracy action that we think is so critical. Those are your closing remarks, Courtney. So I think that's what you said. So Courtney has started it off. Harald, do you want to go next with your closing remarks?
Thanks for bringing it together. Thanks for shining the light on the importance of policy making. I think that is key because a lot of the speeding up of the process can come from there. I think we all need to consider a career in politics, maybe, to also actually make the change happen there, as the political system is a very difficult one. I've been there as well. 3 quick thoughts. Ask all of us to act to change the system from within, and 2, think about the new policies that need to happen to set up a new system. That's on the action side. 2, let's be very careful in a respectful way of driving the collaboration. Sometimes we need to respect the diversity of different parts of the world. I've been becoming very mindful of this in the last weeks and months. because we need everybody. We need the Africans, as they always say, the African continent as much as the Asian continent, and the European countries are playing a role, as well as our wonderful colleagues in North America, where we all know it's not a very important elections coming up in South America. So truly, this can only happen together. And as the Environment Minister of Japan said, we also have to make this transition sexy. We need to, I think, not come and say with the finger, you know, you did bad and the bad companies. I think it's also become very mindful of this. Things have to be set up in a way that it makes it that choice for the way forward. In terms of the new careers, we see a new generation looking at the jobs and systems change and sustainability as the ones that are being preferred. But as long as the private sector can pay double the wages that this kind of work can pay, that's a structural issue we have to look at. And make it interesting to become collaborative and think 1 + 1 is 3, as Courtney's, I think, initiative on the citizen-led design labs are looking for. And the third aspect, bottom-up versus top-down. It's, as we all know, never a way that the politicians can solve alone and citizens can solve alone. It has to come from this big push together. And I think now there are very important moves coming together where roadmaps are being put together on certain sectors. That's what we are doing, for example, for the climate change negotiations, but then put the citizen pressure on making that change happen, showing good bottom-up examples, and helping the industry to really also change and hopefully have CEOs in place that are truly championing this change. So I'm truly hopeful, and I became very mindful also on leadership that we have to exert and show in being humble in whichever positions we are being put in to make the change happen. So I also hope to negotiate and engage after this wonderful conference, Margaret. I hope you guys set up a mechanism to do so, and happy to support that.
We have the mechanism, yeah. Alex and Ed, who wants to go first? Alex.
Yeah, I can go. I mean, just to emphasize on the point that Harald just made on making it sexy. I mean, this is, I mean, you need to shift from a throwaway economy into an economy that preserves and cares for everything and everyone. So you have to make that sexy, and you have to look good in societies because people replicate what the neighbor is doing. So if you make it look good, everybody will follow. Trust, without trust, there's nothing. There's nothing happening. So again, in a throughput economy, linear economy, trust is gone. I mean, it's all about making you sick and making you drink and breathe stuff that you don't want. So trust needs to be rebuilt, and that's why it's critical to design a genuine circular economy with proper rules and local rules, focusing on local communities. And lastly, make it open source as much as you can, because in terms of legal framework, it's about what you desire to see in your country and what you don't want to see in your country. What you want to see in your country is attracting products like Fairphone, because they can be dismantled, they can be repaired, they can be upgraded, they can be made locally, they can create jobs, and they can become your urban mining sources for the future. So open source is also very critical in circular economy. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you. Edge?
Yes, okay, thank you, Margaret. First of all, thank you for inviting me on with such a wonderful panel. I've really enjoyed the perspectives, and I've learned lots of new things today as well, so it broadened my sort of horizons. So thank you everyone on the panel, and I'd love to be engaged further. My final words are, a lot of the circular economy starts with us, and I like to tell people the circular economy starts with the waste that we put out every day, you know, and I don't call it waste, but it's materials at the end of one life ready to go and be reused. So I would really encourage people to buy what they really need, because there's so much pushing on products we actually don't have to have. So I'd certainly be encouraging making sure we only consume what we really have to have. And then when we do purchase these things, we need to select things that are very obviously recyclable within our own capability, so that when we do actually go to do something at the end of life for a product or a package, that it actually does have a destination. And so I really urge people to look carefully at what they do put out and take care, because the businesses that collect this later on have a huge job unscrambling. And the biggest task there is the separation of materials, and it costs energy and time and effort, and there's wastage associated with badly put out materials. So, you know, our circular economy starts with us at the very, like, microscopic scale as consumers. And as consumers, we can have a big impact on big companies by not buying things that they obviously make that are obviously not recyclable. They get the message, and then they will actually change as well. So, and I always ask people to think about themselves as influencers at the micro scale, because yes, we can do policy and so on, that takes time, but we can instantly change big companies by the consumption patterns. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you all of you panelists who have each given such critical perspectives. What I would like to say is that, I mean, I have gained a lot of knowledge as well. You know, from a future law perspective, what we have been looking at and looking for and mapping in these conversations that we are having are some of the best models out there for legal system change in these key areas that we've identified. And so in terms of progressing the circular economy and having legal system interventions at that level, at national levels, we have seen in the past that if the UN were to get involved on these collective organizing issues at the regulatory standpoint by producing model laws, it creates rapid change. It creates rapid change at the legislative level. And if we do not have the UN organizing at that level, what we would have is what has come out of this panel: the EU organizing, Africa organizing, China organizing, Latin America doing something, Thailand doing something, and yet we don't know how coherent these strategies are, and all of these strategies are coming from that country perspective primarily. And so the question is, who is guarding or addressing the collective agenda and ensuring that that aspect feeds into every nation's legislative framework? And so at Future Law, what we are attempting to do in this space, and we want to invite each of you to be a part of what we're doing going forward, to support, to provide your expertise and to help us to shape this area. Because if there is no collective organizing of the various models, an organization is looking at the various models that exist and seeing how they interconnect, seeing how coherent it is, and coming up with a almost as close to a universal strategy, which we understand would have to be customized, but which could help us more aggressively meet these targets, so that countries that don't even have it on an agenda, on their agenda, they can be supported to say, okay, this work has been done here to do this kind of organizing, look at this model. This is what we would like to do to support both the top-down and the bottom-up organizing that would be required. So thank you so much, because you've enriched the Institute with your knowledge on all these different models, and we are recording this and mapping this. And so this has been a really incredible and enriching discussion. Thank you.